Morning. With great pleasure, I welcome you all to this couple engage dissemination event. What is the new normal for family planning and male engagement? So we are starting with a question and we'll continue to have this conversation and we should really look forward to have this very engaging and enriching discussion. I'm Pranita from International Center for Research on Women, your host and moderator of this event. Just quickly give you a rundown of this 90-minute event. We have presentation from the project team, start sharing their journey from insights to solutioning. We have three esteemed panelists with us, Reshma Trasi from Pathfinder, Siddharth Swarup from Facebook, and Ravi Verma from ICRW. All three of them have been co-traveler in this project journey. They will reflect on learnings from the project and take conversation forward on engagement of men and couples in family planning, what is new normal during and post-COVID, opportunities and entry points that have emerged. They will also talk about beliefs and behaviors which have stayed and how all those can be tapped on for gender equitable programming. We will end with a closing remark from Abhijit Pathak, Senior Program Officer at the Gates Foundation. And a quick housekeeping, there is a question answer box. Please use this space to add your questions for the project team or for the panelists, and we will direct those to relevant speakers. Coming back to the issue, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development includes many targets and references to gender equality, empowerment of women and girls, universal access to sexual and reproductive health and rights. If we talk specifically, Target 3.7 calls countries to ensure universal access to sexual and reproductive healthcare services, including for family planning, information and education by 2030. Target 5.6 adds ensure universal access to sexual and reproductive health and reproductive rights. So it really adds the whole issue around rights in accordance with the program of action of the International Conference on Population and Development. The ICPD program of action recognized the positive role men can play in family planning and reproductive health arena and had called for increased engagement of men to be equal partner in decisions and sharing responsibilities. There was a felt need to shift discourse on family planning from women's issue to couples agenda, from family planning being tool to control population to means of empowerment, supported with necessary political and financial. FP 2030 guiding principles also note the involvement of men and boys in tandem with empowerment of women and girls with true equity. These are crucial global commitments given how gendered family planning space continued to be, whether we look at supply side or demand side. There are ample evidence highlighting how prevailing gender norms diminish women's ability to voice their choices and negotiate their preferences around sex, fertility, and family planning. How these norms limit their access to information and services, push them towards unplanned pregnancy, unsafe abortion, and covert use with constant fear of backlash, while giving power and privileges to men to influence women's choices and decisions and regulate their access to services. There are also evidence on effect of masculine notions on men's perception, knowledge, and practices around sexual and reproductive health. How these notions discourage men to acknowledge their sexual and reproductive needs, adopt safe and healthy practices, and seek information and services, affecting not only their own lives, but the lives of women and girls around them. But it's not that all men consider FP as women's. ICRW's study on masculine and intimate partner violence found that only a fifth of men thought family planning is women's business alone, which points to the fact that men may be more receptive than what we think or even their wives think about their engagement in family planning. SDGs have explicit targets on universal access and reproductive rights, but in its current articulation and design, family planning policies and programs, and I'm talking more about Indian context, probably excludes more than it includes. Of late, focus has shifted towards young and low parity women on spacing from female sterilization. But same cannot be said for men. Men engagement is still more of an aspirational. If we really look at the policy documents, they are being mentioned more as clients, not really as equal partners. And that too without clear guidance or approach. Similarly, young unmarried people or people living in families made up of non-normative gender and sexual identities, we really need to think about family planning and how we all define and understand family. They are mostly at the peripheries with sporadic efforts and programming. Even our health workforce is highly gendered. The way it's in its composition, in their perspective, the skills, the type of investment being made in their skill building. It's not to say that things haven't changed. I mean, recently, you must have seen the fact sheet that has been released from National Family Health Survey Round 5 showed a significant increase in contraceptive uptake in several states, including Bihar. Yet family, and I'm talking about Bihar because this whole our project Couple Engage is situated in UP and Bihar. Yet female sterilization continues to be the top method. We hope to see improved access, equity, and quality of services, but it's definitely a long road, and much more is needed to achieve SDGs commitment that we all are. India is also party to it. We need strong gender lens in policy formulation, programming, and research. We need evidence-based gender equitable approaches to engage men, engage couples in family planning. And to contribute towards this larger agenda, the Couple Engage project was designed with support from Gates Foundation. ICRW and Bihara, with their research rigor and design thinking, undertook this 2-year project to build evidence and develop gender equitable approaches to engage young men and women as equal partners in family planning. The project examined motivations and barriers of young men and couples to engage in collaborative and informed decision-making, roles norms play in shaping their intimate space and relationship, their individual and collective aspirations, and several other issues. Situated in UP and Bihar, the project used research and human-centered design. While the project did have its focus on engaging men as equal partners, equal and supportive partners, we realized quite soon that it's essential to work with couples, and hence at the core of this project lies the effort to make the unit of couple an equal playing field for both men and women. And that's how we really want to reimagine family planning program. Several experts, organizations, community members, women and men have contributed in this journey by sharing their experiences and challenges prior to and during COVID times, and we are grateful for their contributions. Without taking any further time, I invite Kuhika from ICRW and Kapil from Vihara to share insights and learnings from the project. Kapil and Kuika, you have 20 minutes and followed by 10 minutes for question and answer. And I request audience to put their questions in question answer box. Over to you, Kuika and Kapil.
Thank you, Pranita. Good evening, everyone. Thank you again for joining us for this share out today. Kuika and I will provide an overview of the various phases of the project, sharing some of the key learnings and our approach to surfacing those insights, and lastly, outlining the major outcomes from the projects, which are in the form of intervention solutions and knowledge products. So now we'll just start and go over these particular areas. Next slide, please. So I'll start off with going through with an overview of what were the various phases of the project. The project was split into 4 phases, starting with global evidence reviews, where we looked at academic peer-reviewed journals. We looked at both current and past programs on FP and SRH, particularly programs which undertook HCD-based methodologies in terms of engaging our target audience, both within the programs and both in terms of design research, as well as conducting expert interviews with change makers and thought leaders within these topic areas. It was followed by an immersion phase where we conducted ethnographic and design-based research in 6 districts across UP and Bihar. These were split equally, 3 in UP, 3 in Bihar, where we undertook a mixture of research and design tools for our engagements. This phase is what culminated in 6 thematic barrier briefs, which essentially outlined what are the macro challenges that our various users are facing in terms of their the journey to uptake to family planning and as well as birth spacing. It was followed by the design and strategic design phase. Apologies, is somebody unmuted? I'm hearing a lot of background noise. Yeah. It was followed by our strategic design phase, where we looked into making our insights actionable. And at the same time, like the rest of the world, we were hit by the COVID pandemic as well. And we undertook a rapid research on COVID to make sure that our insights and outcomes are both future-proof and as well as contribute towards the massive research effort that has been undertaken by the world to fight this pandemic. The major outcomes in this phase were first was an FP journey framework, which looked into mapping what are the various pathways that different couples undertake in terms of both uptake of contraceptives, experimenting with contraceptives, sterilization, and effectively uptake of birth spacing. This piece of work was supplemented by also developing certain couple profiles, where we looked into how do the specific spousal dynamics of a couple impact what pathway they end up taking. So when I talk about spousal dynamics, we looked into what were their communication styles, what were their collaborative patterns, and what were their decision-making styles as a couple. All of these findings and the findings from the previous 2 phases led into the development of a comprehensive theory of change, which included 13 intervention directions or activities in terms of how couples and men can be engaged, using which we had created 4 conglomerate prototypes as a way of testing out what are some of the potential solutions or even program design concepts that could be taken up from this theory of change. The last phase, the partner validation and prototype dissemination phase, here we undertook a series of dissemination and validation sessions with a number of experts and partners within the field, where we looked at reviewing our solutions and as well as our insights from 4 key standpoints, being that our solutions are gender equitable, being our solutions are potentially impactful and feasible and scalable. At the same time, we also concluded our COVID rapid research during this phase. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So some of the key learnings that came from the project, we observed men's perception of masculinity was in direct conflict with the notion of pleasure during sex. What we had observed that men played different levels of, men played different different masculinities across their different life stages, from being a head of a household to internalizing the aspect of what it means for them to be a man, or their understanding of manlyhood in terms of being a procreator, in terms of being a performer. These roles significantly weighed down men in terms of the pressures that they were facing, both internally and externally. How these pressures were kind of demonstrating themselves were men were starting to evaluate their perceptions of, again, their perception or sexual expression along the lines of performance rather than an articulation of pleasure during the sexual act. So we heard a lot of men talk about, whenever we discussed sex or whenever we discussed interaction or intimacy with their partners, this topic of controlling the aspect of intercourse, controlling the narrative of what sexual expression was for the couple, was again being reaffirmed by men as an aspect that they felt they needed to be in control. And this extended to the aspect of contraceptives and pregnancy avoidance. So a lot of men talked about a preference for using, for example, traditional methods such as the pull-out method or the calendar days methods, and having an intimate understanding around what were the unsafe days or the fertile days, even though we saw a lot of evidence that they either had incorrect information or incomplete information, and in a lot of those times they were unable to prevent impregnation. So we saw a lot of potential in terms of linking this aspect of pleasure with sexual activity, as that seems to be a space, or that seems to be a notion that is quite missing in terms of both the articulation of how men are talking about sex, and in turn, due to the power dynamic that is currently in play within the couple, where men are making a lot of decisions, it's affecting how the couple is understanding intimacy, or how the couple is discussing intimacy. Next slide, please. So we tried to unpack a bit more in terms of what are the various things or the various aspects that go into forming a couple. So how do two partners come together? How do they formulate themselves as a married unit? And what are the various factors that could potentially affect their forming or their union of being a married unit? So one of the more interesting things that we had noticed was early on in the marriage, particularly in the first year of the marriage, or in very rare cases where there were interactions between the partners before marriage, there were these little gestures of intimacy, little gestures of gameplay, whether it was in the form of using sign language to talk to your partner when you were around family members, whether it was cooking your partner's favorite food when family members were not around, or even playing a simple board game as innocuous as Ludo. These all contributed significantly in terms of what type of married unit was the couple going to be. So it kind of influenced the type of communication and the collaboration that these couples were demonstrating, and how these could be stepping stones towards negotiating the various norms around masculinity, norms around sex, norms around fertility. So we particularly saw that couples who had these interactions early on, there was more potential for negotiating, even to an extent around what were their specific roles within a marriage, what were the aspirations that the couples were aiming towards within their marriage, and as well as led to kind of eradicating the potentiality for intimate partner violence, domestic violence, and other harmful behaviors that comes from having a couple unit which is heavily leaning towards the male's aspirations and male's desire, and not including the woman's aspirations. So I'll hand over this to my colleague Kuika now to take it forward. Kuika, over to you.
Thank you so much, Kapil. Next slide, please. Yeah, I'll just build on to from where Kapil left. So from both our evidence review and our immersion, there were two pillars that came out and stood out, and those were of power and knowledge. And when we say power and knowledge, we mean the interrelations between the two that shape family planning choices of couples. Knowledge came out as a key determining factor for new use or non-use, or for switching methods. And when we say knowledge, we do not really talk about knowledge in its in a very narrow scope, but as a very comprehensive way in which we mean to say knowledge about one's own body, the changes that it undergoes at different life stages during adolescence, as young adults, when people get married, and so on and so forth. And their understanding around sex and reproduction, intercourse, method use, and side effects. So the entire gamut of knowledge which relates to one's own body. What is of significant importance here is that gendered behavior is nurtured very early during adolescence, and that period is heavily marked with confusion and lack of information. In context that we work in, where there isn't comprehensive sexuality education, and schools do not really intervene in that sense, the gap which is there during adolescence keeps getting intensified for men and women both, as they gradually get married, have children, and aim towards using methods or do not use methods. What is of particular importance here again is to complicate this a little further, is that the pathway of knowledge is also extremely gendered, and it has its own role in perpetuating myths and misconceptions. Because a lot of men and women do take information from their immediate resources and extended network or immediate network. Men were found to be the key sources of information on contraceptive, as well as gatekeepers of information, which means that men were the ones who would decide and filter what should a woman know. And since they were the ones who have smartphones, who actually have a lot of access to the public spaces, they are able to navigate and give the woman certain kind of information. Another interesting point that was observed was that in incomplete knowledge, or when women were the ones who possessed knowledge, it added to the power imbalance between the couple. An already lopsided equation that a couple shares, knowledge with the woman further aggravated that power imbalance, as men perceive that as an inadequacy on their part. So some of these findings around knowledge were very crucial for us to sort of unpack our learnings from both the field and literature. Some enabling factors are, if we enhance knowledge to address the unique needs of couples at appropriate points in their life trajectory, it has the capacity to build agency and trust within the relationship, and also for them to understand themselves individually as well as collectively. Engaging in couple making activities where relationship bonds can be developed, as couple spoke about emotional intimacy in the last slide, that is also that couple making activities build emotional intimacy, and that can be tapped on for better FP choices for the couple. Next slide, please. A very, very important stakeholder in this entire conversation is the health systems, something that cannot be missed and should not be missed. Health systems approach to family planning needs to be more inclusive and gender sensitive for both policy and programs. For people who have been working in either policy, program, or research, or even who are working in SRHR, would know that the language in policy documents, which are the guiding tools for implementation, are gendered in many senses, and they limit the possibility of having a much more inclusive approach. Gender norms sort of shape the perspectives of everyone, from health system actors to policymakers to the last mile service delivery functionaries. And that is of crucial importance, because the shifts trickle down in a certain manner. The understanding and the translation happens in a certain manner. Hence, policy perspectives need to be deep dived into to understand this a little more. Jumping from this, we'll talk a little bit about the frontline health workers, who form the main cadre, who live within the community and address the community needs and know best about the community needs. But they're not away from the perceptions and notions that the community has. And hence their interactions are also coming from a very gendered understanding and space, where many times it was observed that frontline health workers, the Ashas, Ashas and the ANMs, would not interact with the newly married women or connect with them only after they have had the first birth. And in these contexts where speaking to the opposite sex is frowned upon and looked at suspiciously, especially when they are unrelated, they do not converse with men as well. There were many instances of violent backlash and community ostracization that these frontline health workers faced, and which were more pronounced, as we'll see in our subsequent slides, as to what happened during COVID on all of this. Adding a little bit to how the health system looks like, it is a highly incentivized system where a target-driven approach sets the scope of service delivery. It does compromise to a large extent the quality of care, especially around management of side effects and the follow-up care that goes with it. And as we are aware, due to a basket of choice which is very restricted, women have to many a times endure the debilitating health risks of methods on their own bodies, which pronounce as time pass with multiple births and unplanned pregnancies and abortions. What may be a good starting point is a customized approach for couples. No one couple is the same. And as we found out in our research as well, and we did delve into creating typologies based on spousal communication and decision making of the couples, it's very important to see where the couple lies in that continuum. And a customized approach where their fertility intentions are matched with their needs of the bodies and where they lie in their reproductive and relationship trajectories of paramount importance. Gender sensitivity training for health system actors and creating a safe space for the health system themselves is very crucial when it comes to programming and implementation of these policies. Another very important point is to understand the evolving aspirations of this cadre and how do they look at their voluntary employment and what do they think of their future growth career trajectory. Helping them chart that out would also give them an aspirational and a different level of accountability will come in the system. Next slide, please. Coming on to the COVID-19 and its effect on all of this. So the findings that Kapil and I just presented were around the pre-COVID times when we conducted research in the 6 sites. We also conducted a research in UP and Bihar in July and August 2020 on COVID-19 and its impact on the family planning and contraceptive behavior. So what we found there was that physical distancing did not necessarily lead to sexual distancing amongst couples. Women and men from the community did talk about increase in sexual activity. And they spoke about impossibility of abstinence while being within the same physical space. They also spoke about how having, and largely men spoke about this, that how having sex was a brief distraction amidst the ongoing crisis. Spousal communication also saw extreme struggles as COVID-19 induced economic crisis added to the conflicts between partners. And it would be not a stretch to say that more the economic distress, higher was the incidence of conflict between the couples. The contraceptive space and behavior also saw a change. There was a high demand of condoms, followed very closely by pills. And there was also a reportage of post-coitus hacks and traditional method use in spaces where methods were not available. What was interesting to note that financial stress was also used as an alibi for couples to strengthen their arguments with their family members and community to delay the birth of the first child. Technology use, of course, became more intensified from both the demand and the supply side, as frontline health workers were using WhatsApp and other apps for their work, and smartphones came across as a highly accessed medium. We have more insights on COVID, and that can be read on, of course, our detailed knowledge products. Next slide, please. So after laying the lay of the land and understanding what we did from the supply and the demand side, it was found that to engage men and couples in an equitable and sustained way, it's important that we have an approach which is across all layers of the ecosystem that involves all stakeholders. Otherwise, the shifts can be either temporary or short-lived or half-baked. A much more comprehensive approach in that sense is needed. Positive shifts in norms to begin with which are relating to gender and FP, and especially norms around fertility, sex, marriage, and masculinity, need to be negotiated within the couple space and outside. And to view FP as a collective responsibility is very crucial to that change. The health system's approach towards FP uptake also needs to undergo a perception shift from being a prescriptive approach of how and what should a couple do, or an incentive-based approach. It needs to be very aligned with the needs of a couple and what a couple needs at that point of time in their life journey. Communities and families also need to understand family planning a lot more. Their knowledge and comprehension on how various methods work, when should a woman take method or a man should be engaged, and how a couple together needs to understand the utility of it, because in context of South Asia, family members do play a very crucial role in this decision making, and are sometimes sources of knowledge and information as well. And coming to the most important and the layer we really want to focus on is that of the couples. How do we improve capability amongst couples to contemplate and seek FP services, to understand what they need, to feel more confident with each other, to share their needs around family planning, and to communicate about it, and to have a cohesive, comprehensive, and collaborative decision on that issue. And once that is established, negotiating with the health system actors or with the communities and the families and conveying their needs will become far more easier than it already is, because FP is a contentious issue when it comes to talking about it. It will also reduce likelihood of women getting dismissed or alienated or facing violence when she broaches the subject of family planning with her partner, or anyone for that matter. So I'll end with this slide, and I'll pass it on to Kapil to take us through a few more. Thank you.
Thanks, Koika. Next slide, please. Just to quickly touch upon some of the challenges we had in terms of engaging couples on the field before I go into the solution. Of course, talking to couples, especially women, younger women in the presence of their family members and male members particularly, is quite difficult. So taking an approach where we had interactions with men and women separately before we got a chance to do an interaction with the couple was definitely beneficial to give us a better understanding about what were their individual perspectives and how did those individual perspectives change when they came towards as a marriage unit. Applying a mix of design and research tools was also particularly effective in terms of taking some of the pressure off our discussions, particularly around some of the sensitive topics around sex or your marriage, were quite effective in terms of creating a more playful environment, creating an environment which was more prone to discussions, as well as using an approach where we looked at not just interactions between the man and the wife, but going beyond and looking into their interactions with the entire family and the community as a whole, as Koika mentioned in the previous slide, was also quite helpful. Apart saying from this, but that still means to say that engagement of couples as a whole does still pose a lot of challenges when it comes to out-migration, when it comes to long working hours, when it comes to suspicion of engagement. So those challenges are still very much valid and crucial. But just to say that an approach of engaging the couples and applying design tools definitely made our lives a lot easier. Moving on to the solutions. Our approach to solution making was coming at it from a perspective that oftentimes, particularly for people working on SRH and FP solutions, creating novel solutions or creating novel strategies doesn't necessarily ensures their uptake or ensures their scalability. So we wanted to take an approach where we created, like we alluded to in the previous slides, we created larger 13 intervention strategies or activities as we've been calling them, and we combined them to create more unique programs or solutions for various partners, depending upon the right frontline workers or platforms or channels that they have access to. So an example of some of these example of some of this customization is, for example, creating a couple making toolkit for a partner who might be focused more on younger couples and how couples are interacting. This couple making toolkit was more focused around how can we align young couples early on in terms of what their specific aspirations are. So we saw a lot of cases where when we really delved into using our design engagement tools to map out what were the individual aspirations of each of the members, oftentimes they had a hard time articulating them. They had a hard time creating a plan, and they had a hard time kind of talking about how they mean to ensure that they're going to convince their family members to achieve that plan. So creating a toolkit which will help them with those pathways. With men particularly, we saw that a lot of them talked about wanting to be more involved fathers, having their own negative situations or negative experiences in the past where their father was not supportive of them. They talked about how they needed to be more involved fathers, but did not have the peer support network or structure in place to help them create that space for them. So looking into what can be a young fathers network, similar to how we have the SHG models for women right now, which could be beneficial to men. Next slide, please. Some of the other solutions that we kind of looked into was, Kuika talked about the importance of upscaling FLWs. We noticed that a lot of FLWs right now, they lack certain capacities in terms of how do you engage a conversation around, especially a conversation around often taboo subject matters such as family planning or sex, particularly with men. So what are those soft skills that need to be developed that could help them enable to identify those pathways to reach to a point where those conversations could be had? So we looked into developing a scenario-based training module or a digital or a physical platform for FLWs that focuses on providing them with specific scenarios where they're approaching men, approaching couples, approaching women on specific topic areas, so they can build up those soft skills, which oftentimes they do over a long period of time when they're providing their services and not necessarily beforehand. In terms of engaging adolescents, couple making, as we kind of underlined, was a key point of intervention, as that's the marker that often defines what type of relationship a couple is going to have. So looking into how can that support be provided early on, and even before marriage, looking at adolescent girls, adolescent men. So one of the solutions we had looked into is a relationships-based coach. With digital access being more and more pervasive, it's still not perfect, but it is getting better. How can we tap into existing fandoms, whether it's around TV characters, movie characters, fictional characters, and intersplice elements or intersplice elements of communication, consent, mutual respect, and pleasure in new and interesting ways. So that's all we had to share in terms of the project. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, there are certain knowledge products that currently are available. First being the couple engage evidence review, the programmatic review, and a brief on family planning in the times of COVID. These are all readily available. There's a link in the chat for you to access them. Next slide, please. As well as the briefs on the thematic barriers that we talked about, which contain the macro challenges that our target audience is being faced with, and contains a number of micro challenges and suggestions on how we could potentially tackle these various solutions. Thank you everyone for listening to us. Over to you, Pranita.
Thank you, Kapil and Kuika. It was a very interesting and enriching. There are a few questions which some of the attendees have mentioned in the chat box, which Aishwarya is responding to. But I think there is a couple of questions around this rapid research that we did during COVID time. Kuika, do you want to mention some quick, like what were the issues and challenges, and how team navigated that time in terms of data collection?
Sorry, Pranita, can I request you to tell me that question exactly?
So the question, let me exactly, okay, who approached, like there are a few questions, but there is like one question: who approached the men over phone? Was it women from the team or men? How it was received? So okay, there are some of those questions.
I'll begin. So we did do remote interviews, and the most important part of it was establishing connect with local partners. And we did go to the same field sites, go as in approach remotely, as we did in our prior immersion, which happened pre-COVID and in person. So our sites were the same. We already had established contact with local partners there. For our immersion, male interviewers spoke to men, and women interviewers spoke to women. And we also had the third engagement jointly, where in the first two engagements, and the same researchers were there together in the third engagement to do it with the couple, so that there is immense and adequate rapport building, so that we could placate the fears of both the partners. And that's how we did it during immersion, which is pre-COVID. But for COVID research with that we did remotely, we took help from our local partners in the field, and women interviewers spoke both to men and to women. And these connections were made over the phone. There was prior consent taken. One consent was taken from the local partners, and then the local partners took it from the respondents, and we also took consent for audio recording and everything, and that's how we approached it. Anything specific, please write to us on the chat box.
Thank you, Kuvika. There are some very interesting questions which I definitely would like to take later also. So like there's a question, it is often argued how contraceptive uptake for women instead of sharing it with their partners might be more empowering for them in terms of taking control over their body and their reproductive futures, as they are the one who go on to mainly undertake childbearing and child rearing responsibilities. Was there such a narrative expressed during the field work? So just quickly, in the field work, what we had range of response and experiences. So there are women who have such similar experiences, or just because men in their household or their husband were not really very keen on taking in responsibility, women were taking those responsibility and making those decisions, but not necessarily always in the comfort, they were exercising their agency, but it was not always true for all women, because still a lot of men, especially at a younger age, men were taking those decisions. So what we are talking about is, it's not about compromising with women's agency. That engagement with men should really trample the empowerment or the agency of women, but it should not just be women's responsibility alone to take these responsibility. They should be they should take responsibility, but they should also be equal partner in making those choices and decisions, and able to express their choices and preference. So that is what is important when we talk about engaging men as equal partner. So now taking some of these discussion forward, I'll now invite the three panelists, and I'll just briefly introduce all three of them. So we have Reshma, who is Project Director Resolve at Pathfinder. She has over 20 years of experience in strategy development, applied research, data use, and leading health and development programs in Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. She is apt at combining data and community voices to design innovation and responsive products and services, and to inform policies. Welcome, Reshma. We have, I'll introduce all three of you, and then we'll have this discussion. We have Siddharth Swaroop, who is India Lead, Social Impact, Education, Communities at Facebook. He's a communication specialist and entrepreneur, writer, and serial innovator. Sid has worked across 17 countries and managed large communication projects. He was also a program officer of Couple Engage project. So Siddharth has history of this project. Ravi is regional director, ICRW Asia. He has more than 3 decades of experience in programmatic research and evaluation in the area of family planning and reproductive health, gender mainstreaming, and HIV/AIDS. Ravi is passionate about grounding his work in gender equality with special emphasis on men and masculinities. So I welcome all 3 of you, and I'll begin with Reshma. Reshma, you heard the findings from the presentation. You have been working in family planning for many years. You understand the sector pretty well. How do you see men engagement in family planning? For what purpose and how? And we just heard another audience question that men engagement should not really compromise with women using their agency or their empowerment. So if you can just reflect a little bit on this, also considering what are the possible pitfalls and challenges that as programmer, researcher, policymaker, one should be really mindful of.
Thank you, Pranita. And before I start, just kudos to the Couple Engage team. It's been a pleasure working with you guys. Just the richness and the nuances of unpacking the black box of couplehood, I think, is just such an important first step towards promoting intimacy, trust, communication, positive norms. I think that can have much longer term significant benefits for the health and well-being of the couple as well as the family. And also just thank you for inviting me to this session. A true pleasure indeed. So maybe first getting a little bit into the socio-ecological approach that you all talked about, and maybe mentioning some 4 broad approaches that we at Pathfinder International have found are really important elements for next generation programming as we work with men and couples. One I would say is the importance of gender synchronized approaches. And a really great example for us here is the Yuva program. It's Youth Voices for Agency and Access. And I think the key element of this is promoting spousal communication and family planning as an aspirational lifestyle choice. We're working in Bihar and Maharashtra. It takes into consideration couple typologies. And what we're doing within this program is implementing what we're calling Yuva Core, where young married couples are conducting home-based and digital app-supported family planning counseling for married couples in their communities, as well as providing delivery of contraceptives. And we're really looking forward to launching a digital app shortly within this program. I think a second approach and element in engaging men in family planning programs is in communities where perhaps this couple approach is not, where the community is not yet ready perhaps for the couple approach, and where we're doing more gender sensitive approaches, where we're working within the community, but in either peer-to-peer support networks or in group discussion formats. And a great example here, and I'd encourage you all to go to the website and look into this, is the Pathfinder-led Evidence to Action project. And what we're doing here is really harnessing men's sense of responsibility towards their own families. And the portfolio of first-time parent programs that's been implemented in Burkina Faso, Nigeria, and Tanzania, using a codified curriculum for facilitated discussion that builds on sort of global programs like Promundo and a lot of the work that ICRW also has done, really looks at addressing facilitated discussions on fatherhood, relationships, and shifting these attitudes towards family planning and reproductive health that are necessary for family health. And one of the things that we learned through this programming is that sessions on relationship building and conflict resolution were in high demand. So I think it sort of reinforces what you all are finding through Couple Engage, that there is a hunger, there is a need and demand from men to really want to be better partners, not just for family planning and supporting couple fertility goals, but the family health in general. 2 other approaches that I think are important for us to keep in mind with the socio-ecological framework is working with key influencers like mother-in-laws and religious leaders. And this is work that Pathfinder does around the world in all of our approaches. I think a big shout out is to our Niger program that works specifically with religious leaders in a very conservative environment, bringing in their support to engage men as partners towards family health. And last but not the least, I think we need to think about how we can leverage services that men are already seeking. So what are the touch points within the health service, within the health sector in general, and how do we then bundle family planning with other services? For example, if men are seeking primary health care, how do we bundle family planning there and have sort of safe spaces within which to have these programs? I think 3 challenges that I'll maybe touch on, in addition to social and gender norms and the fact that there are very few contraceptive options for men to start with. One, I think, is migration. We noticed this, and this is important, I think, not just for our program in India, where especially in Bihar, 70% of men migrate to other states like Punjab, Gujarat, and Maharashtra, but also in many other countries where we work. And I think one of the key challenges we have is when men are away for protracted periods of time, women are often reporting challenges in seeking long-acting contraceptive methods that provide year-long coverage, right? So it's a case of, okay, if the husband is away, why do you really want a long-acting method? Because sexual intercourse isn't necessarily happening with the partner. And so that, I think, becomes sort of a key challenge in addressing family health. A second one, which I think you all talked about, was health service responsiveness to men. I think 2 things that we've noticed here is we're seeing both sides of the spectrum in terms of our programming. In Mozambique, for example, health workers are quite used to staying after hours to meet men after clinic hours, after work. But that's not always happening, uniformly across the other countries. And the other challenge, of course, we're having in many countries is health workers, especially frontline health workers, are women and are reluctant to broach sexual reproductive health issues with men. So I think that's another challenge that we really need to be able to grapple with and try in a bit of programming there. And finally, I think men's attitudes towards family planning are challenging and they're complicated. But on the other hand, they're also shifting. Our work in Bangladesh, the project that I lead, Resolve, where our behavioral research indicated that that female garment workers often miss taking oral contraceptive pills because they're tired, there's a scarcity mindset. When we ask them if there's anybody that they can recruit that can remind her daily, most women pick their husband. So, we think that there is a shift happening here. But I think finally, the comment that was made about, making sure that this is not a zero-sum game, that we are not sort of working with men while forgetting about women. I think making sure that eventually we are not creating unintended consequences for the women through our approaches of engaging men, I think becomes really important. One of the things that we learned through our programming is that there is an emerging, perhaps nascent, and we don't know enough about this, but the covert use of contraceptives, where women are seeking contraceptives to protect and manage their own fertility goals, often without the approval or knowledge of the partner. And I think in places where we are looking at couples' approaches, that's an aspect that we do need to look into, so we are not introducing unintentional harm into those communities. So maybe let me stop there, and I'm happy to come back to some of these points later on.
Thank you, Reshma. I think you have brought out several points in terms of the approaches, from gender synchronized programming to the programming which may really focus on facilitated discussion in the communities where couples may not be ready to join in the conversation as yet. So I think one is about really what is the intention, keeping that intention, use gender transformative approaches to engage men and women in family planning, and really positioning this whole thing about being partner in decision making and taking responsibility. I think these are extremely important points to remember. I'll bring Sid here to say that, these are very important, and maybe as a tech expert, how do you see tech playing a role in facilitating these discussion, given that we already know that there is huge gender differential in terms of the access and use of technology? So, Sid, how do you see use of tech in the COVID and in future moving forward?
Sure. Thanks, Pranita, and good evening, everyone, and good morning to those who are not here. I'll just zoom out a little bit, and given that I was part of this program when it started, one thing that we were very clear about is that male engagement is not about giving men the control to make decisions, right? And that's why the project was called Couple Engage. We had lots of discussions about that. To me, male engagement is really about equality. It's about equal stake of men and women or the couple in family welfare, in family health, and in family economics, because all of these things are intrinsically linked to family planning. So I think the key here is to look at how do you create that equality, right? And where technology can potentially play a role in creating that equality. So I would say there are three core elements to creating that equality within the context of family planning. I think the first is creating equality through creating relevance amongst men. I think currently we know that men don't necessarily think that family planning is their domain, right? So I think until you create that relevance, they have no stake, and if they don't have a stake, they don't have an interest in participating. The second is equality through empowering women themselves, so that they can be more active players in their own life decisions and their body and health decisions. And the third is equality in the relationship between couples, right? So these are the three layers of equality that I can quickly talk about. And I think the reason why there is low relevance amongst men is because of what we've done for years. For years and years and years, we as programmers have focused family planning programs on women. All the advertising has been targeted at women. So we've actually brought down the relevance for men in family planning. Also, I think the positioning of family planning as a health issue is slightly challenging, because health in general is seen as women's domain, but in reality, family planning has enormous consequence on family economics, right? Family welfare, and we haven't used that as a hook, at least not enough for men to say, hey, this is also my business, right? This is not just about health. This is also about something that I think is my domain. So really creating relevance through the right positioning of family planning in the context of men and women. And I think within that realm, I think very early on in this program also, we had started talking about, could we, for example, this is a very general example, could we start a course on financial planning for men, where family planning is an integral part of that course, because you can't really plan your finances over the next 5-10 years without thinking about how many children have to be fed, educated, married off, etc., right? So that's and those courses could easily be run on technology, on whether it's as simple as IVR or on different platforms. So that's just one example of how we could create relevance for men. When we come to creating equality for women, right, I think the traditional approach has been that because there is unequal gender norms, there is a gender gap in access to technology, which then leads to reduced access to information, knowledge, etc. We've been studying this in a lot of detail at Facebook, especially my team. And what we've realized, we actually came across a study which was published in the American Scientific Journal in 2018, which talks about, the researchers looked at data of about 1.2 billion Facebook users across about 200 plus territories around the world. And what they figured out was that in countries where the gender gap on Facebook was lower in 2015, gender equality improved the following year. And this is financial equality and many different metrics of gender equality. However, the reverse was not found to be true. which was and the kind of the conclusion of that research was that a lower gender gap on internet or Facebook is more likely a determinant of a lower gender of increased gender equality rather than a product of it, which turns traditional thinking a bit on its head, because we always keep saying that, oh, women will not get access because there's a lot of gender norms. So it's a chicken and egg situation. Now we said, okay, fine, if this is what the research is, why are more NGOs, etc., not spending more money on giving access of technology to women? And we also started to realize how access to technology is viewed, right? And this is how it is. It's almost like a pyramid. Think of it like a pyramid. At the base, which is the largest cohort, are gender norms, right? And these gender norms then impact access, which then impacts whether women have smartphones or not, or access to smartphones or not, etc., right? The next level on that pyramid is basically ability to use a smartphone, use different technologies. I actually personally find that as an excuse, because if a 2-year-old can use a smartphone intuitively, a woman can. I don't know if it's our patriarchy that feels that women can't use mobile phones. I think it's just a function of lack of access. If they play around, anybody plays around with any smartphone for an hour, they'll figure out everything, right? It's designed to be intuitive. But at the top of the pyramid lies the problem, right? At the top of the pyramid are use cases that are relevant to women. And what we've seen is that when there is a relevant use case, the other barriers start to break down. So we were interviewing nurses in Bihar about, and we asked them, do you use WhatsApp? And they said, yes, we all use WhatsApp because we have a nurses group on WhatsApp and we exchange information, we get instructions, we get peer support, etc., etc. Then we said, do you use other things on your mobile phone in terms of other internet use? And they said, no, we don't, because that's for pleasure, right? So in their mind, a legitimate use case is really, there is a certain legitimate use case. It may be different for a nurse and different for a health worker and different for a housewife, but there is a legitimate use case. But the moment that legitimate use case is seen as legitimate, all the other barriers suddenly break down. Again, turning that logic on its head, rather than trying to change the social norms first and then saying, now we will create use cases and you'll see the other barriers starting to break down. So I think that's a really interesting way of how we think about equality using technology, where we are not constrained by first trying to solve for gender norms and then trying to come up with use cases. And I think finally, talking about equality in relationships, I think we've seen that, right again, from the beginning of this project, very early indications that, when you talk about, for example, migrant couples, how do they stay in touch? Everybody is doing WhatsApp calls, right? They're doing video calls. Couples are doing video calls all the time. Old people are doing video calls, right? Like our parents, who we would have thought would never, even think of using that technology, are doing video calls every day, right? So we know that technology is changing the way couples interact with each other. And I think there was this whole, even in what Koika was mentioning in a presentation, there is this sense that if women have more information and knowledge, men might feel threatened. And I think, again, technology provides an interesting way of gamifying knowledge sharing, knowledge gaining, having discussions. And there are some games that have been developed that I'm aware of that are very interesting, that couples can play together, learn together, have uncomfortable discussions in a comfortable way, because they're thinking of it as a game rather than thinking of it as a very difficult conversation to have. So again, technology can play a really important and critical role in breaking down the barriers to communication by providing new tools, new methods, new ways of couple engagement that weren't possible in the real world. And if they were, I mean, they're too expensive, because let's say you were to take a board game, how many board games will you actually take to how many villages and to how many couples? But technology can do that. Like recently we just did for COVID, we tied up with Ludo King, which is one of the most popular games in India during COVID. They were getting about 20 million plays per day, And we said, let's do a game on wearing masks, right? So you get out of your house, and if you don't have the mask, you can die, or you get quarantined and so on. We developed that game in less than a month, and we got about 20 million new plays in the first week. So, that's the power of technology. You get scale, you get economy. You can actually do stuff that in the real world would cost 1,000 times more. We've done randomized controlled trials using Facebook community groups, which in the traditional world, in the old world, 2 years back had costed 1.5 crores for a particular sample size for less than 50,000 rupees, right? So there's cost, there's or economy, and there's possibility of true innovation when it comes to breaking down barriers. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Siddharth. It was really very interesting. You talked about relevance, making family planning relevance for men, making technology use legit, for women. I'll come back to some of the questions around the possible pitfalls, because we also see that social media is very powerful, and power can go either way. So what it means, and what are the important consideration that as programmer, as researcher, we need to be mindful of. But I'll come back after having this conversation with Ravi. So Ravi, one question that are really important and maybe we would like to reflect on is, masculine notions are there, and we heard about this whole articulation of men in terms of power and control, and not so much about pleasure, like what we heard in from the findings. How do you see, even before COVID, but definitely COVID, at the time of COVID and moving forward, how that might have the uncertainty, fear, or any other factors which you think can be important to consider, can influence men's behavior and their boxed masculine identities, and what it means for family planning and men's engagement in family planning. So if you can reflect on this.
Well, well, at the outset, let me also congratulate the team for doing a real great work and being so provocative on this issue. I don't think you are asking me to do psychoanalysis of the men during this COVID-19 as to how and why they reacted and the way they reacted. I think that would require a far more in-depth studies. But let me backtrack, and I think a couple of things that strike me after listening to all these findings and the conversation. One, that the idea of masculinity is not static, it's fluid, it's relational, we know it's changing. We have seen in the family planning program also, there was a time when men came forward and accepted family planning methods. There was a time, in 70s, 60s and 70s when camps were held, and there were a lot of fanfare around the acceptance of family planning by men. It was, and it's important, it was the arrival of tubal ligation, which literally changed the technology is a double-edged sword, in fact. That at that point in time in 80s, when the tubal ligation came, and the obsession with the population growth as some kind of a fear, it made women target. I'm talking especially of India. I mean, there are audiences from other countries, but in India, the fact that you pointed out about the sterilization as being the most prevalent method, and since then, since 80s, the health professionals, they rush towards making huge amount of money by conducting operations day in and day out, and everybody knows the story of what happened, and what happened till ICPD and Beijing. It was reminded that, look, this is not, it's completely skewed. But by the time we had lost the men from this conversation, the entire technology, in fact, helped the people in power to frame the narrative, which was not towards equality, not really engaging, or not really building on the momentum that men had already shown in that. But what it and then came the HIV and scenario of sexuality being explicit, and there is a lot of conversation on how to challenge and change masculinity norms. Until now, we see that we are struggling to get men into this whole discussion. And my sense is that we are still very instrumentalist in our thinking. And we don't recognize that. And it's so good that the study found out, and so good that the some of the work that is happening in recent times on norms show that these norms can be changed. There are ways to address some of these norms. And I think the use status that Sid talked, I think one needs to be mindful that the use status increase and having a norms change program should be part of the same thinking, same paradigm. Otherwise, it's very likely that in an unequal societies, inequitable distribution of resources and access, very, very often the user status would favor or advantage those who are already in the position of advantage. I think the work on engaging men or masculinities should go beyond the discussion around men versus women. And I think Reshma said this is not a zero-sum game, and that is the crux, that most programs need to bring in the idea of changing norms in a manner that does not let the use status perpetuate the inequalities or inequities, or the inequity or the use status should be changed, keeping in mind that it really impacts the upstream norms. So there's a lot of work to be done on both fronts, in fact. And I think what we tend to do is just cling on to the low-hanging fruit, providing technology and these mediums, and hope that this will spin off into some kind of a change. But that change it's too late for us to realize that change has gone into the wrong direction, completely in wrong direction. It has created huge gaps in those who, between those who had powers and those who are powerless or marginalized. And I think, and that is important. I'll not really go too far into, because there's time. I'm mindful of questions and others, and I have a stake in this study, so I don't want to take up this space. But I really want to remind all of us that the work on norms has, in last few years, have really alerted us that how important it is to move, to think out of the box in terms of measuring community norms and impacting community norms, and going beyond individuals' attitudes and behaviors. And that means that it is far more complex than what we think, in these programmatic terms. And that's what this particular study really brings out on each one of those domains. So yes, I'll just stop here. But thank you very much for the study and for having me on this.
Thank you, Ravi, for sharing your thoughts. We have 5 more minutes, and I'll like to go back to Sid on that question that, social media technology is very powerful medium, but are there pitfalls? That is something that one should be very careful about, or the type of misuse, potential misuse that we see, because we also know that there are tech facilitated violence that are happening. So some guidance that you would like to give on that?
Yeah, thanks. So it's absolutely true. I think any medium has risks, right? A woman traveling on a bus has risk as much as a woman being on a social platform has risks, right? I think being aware of those risks and helping women navigate through that risk is something that I think all technology companies are, heavily invested in. having said that, I think at the same time, technology provides opportunity for extremely safe spaces also, right? A moderated, contained WhatsApp group is an extremely safe space. Nobody can penetrate that, right? It's end-to-end encrypted. Similarly, there are a lot of community groups on Facebook that are closed community with their private community groups, and women are thriving on those groups. In fact, there are more groups being run and larger groups being run by women than there are by men in many cases, and they're discussing things from pregnancy, childbirth, breastfeeding, pretty much everything. I mean, some of our largest groups are on breastfeeding, for example, in India, right? So and those are completely safe spaces. So I think as a programmer, it's incumbent on us to understand the pitfalls of the technology, which are not very hard to understand, and then create safe spaces which are accessible to women, and they can thrive within those safe spaces. And in one of my earlier talks, I think ICIW was part of that, or Ravi was at least part of that. I talked about this example of a woman who's created a group of 1 million farmers, and she's just a uneducated farmer with a basic feature phone. So if she can do that, a lot of large NGOs can.
Thank you, Sid. We have, I suppose, just 2 minutes, just one round of like rapid fire. One important opportunity that you think COVID has given us to reimagine family planning. Just few seconds, take few seconds, and we'll start from Reshma, then Sid, and then Ravi.
I mean, nothing pushes innovation like a crisis, right? And I think we've learned a lot by being in this crisis mode. Things that we thought we couldn't do. I mean, I think Sid's example of our parents getting on video calls with us using WhatsApp, I think, is a great example of that. And to that, to an opportunity for us to be trying new models, I think is something that I hope will help us to build back better in a way, right? Not just for women and family planning, but for men to engage in this conversation, and for us to be looking at family health. And I think the second one I will mention definitely is, hopefully this will bring us, help us as a sector to do better with integrated programming. I think the COVID-19 crisis has shown us the critical link between health and livelihoods, and the economics in general of not just families but a nation. And I hope that this will lead us to more integrated programming, perhaps even extending into climate change. Thank you.
Thanks, Reshma. Sid, 30 seconds.
Sure. I think what COVID has done is taught us about exponential curves. I think especially the development sector has been really bogged down by linear curves and thinking that past data helps explain the future. And I think hopefully one of the learnings that we'll all have from this is that past is no longer prologue to the future, and you can create innovations that can just propel things in a new direction without having to worry about how things worked in the past and what the incremental changes were in the past.
Thanks. Ravi?
Well, I think COVID-19 has brought in many positive experiences as well. And it was such a major external influence on how couples and individuals live together and cope. It must have had some impact on how some of the relational aspects transformed. And if there are stories of positive shifts in the gender relations, and if there are certain undercurrent of normative shifts during COVID-19, men participating in household chores, or if there are, we must really see how sustainable are these, and how much of this kind of, because we also see, we always say that masculinity, the whole idea of gender is situated within the larger context. If the context has changed so much, what has it done to the gender relations at the micro level? And I picked up the key word from you all, that no one couple is same, or the macro realities. That needs to be really looked at more carefully. We need to do a lot of research now on norms and measuring during these kind of crisis situations.
Thank you, Ravi. Lot of ideas for new research, programming, and of course, reflecting all those in our part of our policy. Thank you, all three of you. Very nice reflection and enriching reflection. Now, towards the end of our event, now I request Abhijit to give his closing remarks. Briefly, Abhijit is a medical graduate with vast experience of contributing to national and international healthcare enterprises ranging from health IT and financing to managing health system and community health. Over to you, Abhijit.
So thank you, Pranita. Thank you for giving me the opportunity and inviting me for the closing remarks. This is going to sound like an Oscar speech because I'm going to thank a lot of people. But I really thank you first. Amazing job at moderating this. Thank you for the project team, both the ICRW team as well as Vihara team. And thank you for organizing this. Conversations about family planning have always marginalized men. It's good to dive deep into and into this topic. Thank you for also laying out, Pranita, the rationale of men engagement. Although I know, and thank you to the audience. I've been looking at the questions, some really challenging stuff there. I know that this area often evokes a lot of issues and questions, and I'll come back to why there are good reasons for that. But as far as whether investments in men, engaging men into family planning is good, is needed, and is effective, the answer to all three of these have now been found by evidence, and you and your team have actually synthesized all of that evidence, and we saw the presentations from both Kapil and Kohika talk about that evidence. Now, just to add a few things. So first of all, and thanks to Sid, I think thanks to Sid for conceptualizing this, the phases that we saw in Kapil's presentation to really conceptualize this model. And then to hand it over to me so that I benefited from the learnings that we had. It's been long since I've worked in this area, and so that's why I said that, I really liked some of the questions about empowerment, about digital gap, some of the things that Sid said. Thank you, Sid, for also saying one very important line, which is for me at least, and for the foundation, the cause of engaging men is actually the cause of gender equality, and that's the so I think Ravi also talked about it a bit, but I think grounding whatever we did, and this investment did a lot of that, grounding all of that into the women's health agenda, for and to serve the women's empowerment agenda. And I think making sure that not beyond the four sort of ethical questions of non-maleficence, beneficence, etc., we really went beyond to really serve the gender equality cause wherever and whatever we did in this investment. Thank you for Sid to also sort of laying out that I saw that the audience had a lot of questions about the digital gap. Now, gap in digital access and gap in digital literacy, which are the two pyramid layers that that Sid talked about. I think while currently we are seeing this, but I think Sid at the last remark also talked about the exponential curves. Now, while this gap does exist, there are two things I want to bring forward. One is some investments and data, right? So a few other programs that even Sid has been involved with, we look at the evaluation of Kilkari. Sure, there has been some attrition because of those two layers below. But those that we did manage to get to, there has been a significant change. And as the exponential curve of digital access as well as digital literacy grows, and I often remember Sid having talked to me about this, that it doesn't grow in years or months, that daily millions of people join on. And as this curve grows, we will see that we will be able to reach out to more and more women. And as we reach out to more and more women and couples, the same impact gets multifold. So I think we have to keep that in mind while we look at the current state of digital gap. Also, thank you for asking some of the questions about whose job is it to use family planning. I'm talking about the audience, audience asking some challenging questions. I think it was really very clear and something that all the panelists hinted about, that this project was trying to explore not just men as users of family planning, which is a very important group. But I think, and then there were a lot of questions about the second important group, which is men as partners of women who are using family planning. But I think the third area of exploring their attitudes about family planning, testing the idea that they could be agents of change and advocates for family planning. I think all three of this was an important part of this project, which makes me really proud of it. And finally, what makes me really proud that I think we didn't talk about much because of time in this session was that we already started, at least those in the know in the SRH field, people like Ravi and ICRW, we started with knowing that engaging men is important and that it will have impact. But really to then, by the end of the project, translate it into 15 intervention ideas, more than 4 prototypes, really being ready in a modular approach to take this out of the lab and into the ground and to really test it. And I think that is a huge achievement, and I really am very proud of the investment for this. Some points, again, data. We have known from our large surveys that the foundation does in UP and Bihar that most couple making, and I'm talking about 3/4 of decision making for family planning, is being made jointly by the couple. So it's not made alone by the woman or not made alone by the man. In fact, we have qualitative statements from mother-in-law saying nobody asks me anymore. And then we look at the NFHS 5 fact sheets that Pranita hinted about, the increasing use of traditional methods, the increasing use of spacing, the increasing evidence of experimentation. All of these point to the role of the theory of change that Kapil was trying to present about how do we make sure that young couples start communicating about family planning, start experimenting with a method that they think is good for them, and then land upon a method that's really good for them. And I think that entire sort of theory of change is really helpful in programming for the future, akin to something that Reshma, thanks again for highlighting a lot of Gates funded programs. Actually, Yuva, I'm also the program officer for Yuva. I know Manish is right now in the audience. Some very interesting stuff happening there, like Reshma pointed out. I also must mention that some of the slides that the audience saw with Kapil, the same kind of data ICRW was gracious, and this project was gracious to hand over to another of my grants, which was also started by Sid, which is trying to engage men in SHGs for not just family planning, but for nutrition as well. And in the audience, there were some questions about, are there good examples in other countries? There have been some very good examples beyond family planning in education, in nutrition, etc., that can be explored elsewhere. Andy, I know is in the audience, who leads that other project with PCI. COVID impact and the power of tech. I think Kohika's slides and then Sid's speech also talked about it. I think we should not take it lightly. I think digital really gives us a power that we haven't seen before in terms of programming, and stretches a programmer's imagination like never before. So I don't want to take much more time, especially because since I started talking, 20 people have left. But I think they didn't lose much because the real experts have already spoken. I really thank all of you for having invited me here for the closing remarks. I thank all the speakers. I thank Ravi and Sid and Pranita and Kohika and Kapil for all the learning that they've given me. So thank you. Over.
Yeah, thank you, Abhijit. Thank you, Sid, and thank you, Foundation, for investing in this issue. And we all have to keep our sleeves up. So it's not, we are doing really great work, but as I said earlier, the road is pretty long, and we need to really make a lot of dents on the norms that are there, use technology to engage women, men, couples. And today we talk mostly in terms of gender binary, but we know there are other people also who need to be included and integrated within the family planning landscape. So there are a lot of things that we really need to work on. We got a lot of insights and ideas for our next phase of research and for programming. And I really thank all of you, all the panelist members, presenters, and also the audience. All the questions that you posed, you really pushed us to think more. And we have noted all the questions, and we'll also try to reach out to you with specific answers and have more conversation on this. Thank you everyone. We are very much on time. And with that, I really thank all of you. Thank you.